Jesus is King. Christ is risen. This is Timothy Flanders at the Meaning of Catholic. Welcome back to Jews, Judaism, and Israel, the history of a people. This is our series at the Guild community at Meaning of Catholic. This is part 25, which is entitled Against Zionism with Dr. Matthew Tsakanikas. And we also have Mr. Gary Tapborn also joining us, which he did a lot of the history with two different parts. So, Dr. Stakanikis, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Sure, absolutely.
So, if you don't know Dr. Stakanikis, he is a professor at Christendom College. His publications can be found in Communio, Logos, a journal of Catholic thought and culture, Catholic Will Report, and he also has a Substack, Catholic460.substack.com. And you can click the links below to access there's two different texts we're going to be talking with Dr. Tsakanikas about. One is called Against Catholic Zionism at Crisis. The other one is called Biblical Catechesis. The Church is the, quote, Israel of God, Galatians 6:16. That's at his Substack. But before we get into the topic, tell us about this text you've been publishing on a catechesis on deification, transfiguration, and luminous mysteries. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, great. Thank you. So that's kind of a republication of a manuscript I've been putting out freely. And Root Books and Media were really kind to um, let me let me briefly do some re-editing to it and put it out through them. And so really I believe this is kind of the solution and part of what's really necessary for re-evangelizing Catholics who've fallen away. And that is the emphasis on this very mystery of the kingdom. And so I really believe there's a lot of misunderstanding on what is the kingdom itself. And as I like to quote the early church fathers, the kingdom is the spirit. This is what Gregory of Nyssa says in interpreting the Lord's Prayer. This is what ancient manuscripts of St. Luke have. Instead of saying, thy kingdom come, thy basileia come, it actually says, thy pneuma come in some of these ancient manuscripts. And so to come to the understanding that the kingdom is the spirit is what really is what I'm in fact trying to do to explain a proper approach to understanding even the political state of Israel's existence today, in distinction from the Israel of God, which is the Catholic Church. I think we really have to come to that understanding. I think deification is key because it is, in many times, even in well-catechized Catholics, they haven't had a chance to study how the early patristics discuss um, our sanctification, and they discuss it in terms of deification. So this book takes a look at really trying to understand the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 460. And that's why my Substack is called Catholic460.substack.com. It's because I'm focusing on the Athanasian kerygma that God became man so that man might become God, and catechizing on how to properly understand that mystery of grace. And so giving the patristic understanding of our seamless sanctification, which is always referred to throughout all of the early fathers as our deification. And so I use especially the luminous mysteries to illustrate it.
Well, it sounds fascinating. I'd love to have a whole podcast just about that topic. Perhaps we'll get you on again about that. We can take a look at that some more. So thank you so much for writing that. I'm excited to take a look at that. So let's talk about Zionism. As
Okay.
I like to do in this particular topic, because it is extremely controversial and charged, and many people have very strong opinions, and that's okay. We want to get into all the strong opinions, but I'd like to first start by tell us a little bit about your background. I was just talking before we went recording. Your last name, Tsakanikas, is of Greek origin.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your just spiritual theological formation, how you came to the views that you have about Zionism, what influenced you in particular? Tell us a little bit about yourself in that.
Wow. And remind me to say a couple of things of what you just said there, but let me start with this. Um, so I think to some degrees we've already even called this something like against Zionism,
Yeah.
this podcast. And I always like to make a distinction right away. It depends on the kind of Zionism you're talking about that I'm against. So I'm not against, and I have to make lots of nuances, of course. I'm not necessarily against what happened um, from 1917 till 1948 and what we were left with after 1948, after the British pulled out of their mandated Palestine. And so I can support and have supported the aspects of political Zionism, secular Zionism. I do not support is what is referred to as religious Zionism, seeing somehow that the Old Testament still gives people who claim to be Jewish or of Israeli ancestry, or Israelite, I should say, ancestry. I'm against any form in which they believe they specifically have the right to take land that belongs to Palestinians based on Old Testament promises. So I'm against religious Zionism. I can support and have supported secular or political Zionism. So let me start there. Secondly, I would go into my interest in this stems from actually, I originally started writing this in 2010. I just haven't had enough time to go back to visit some of this. I did not like seeing in 2010 Israel, New York City Jewish communities sending money over to Israel to sponsor billboards on the sides of buses to drive them through East Jerusalem, which is under the Palestinian Authority. And so they were sending these buses with billboards on the side showing a picture of the third temple, making very clear we want this to happen as soon as we can. And there was no Al-Aqsa Mosque and no Dome of the Rock. And so clearly they were saying, we're going to push you out of here and build a third temple. And this was incitement. And I thought, we have troops all over the world right now. We have troops fighting in the Middle East, trying to keep peace, and we don't need to be dragged any further to getting our soldiers killed. So I wrote about that. I started writing about what is a proper understanding of the kingdom and Jesus. And I hadn't had a chance to write again. But what caused me to start writing again was I started seeing Catholics trying to promote a form of Catholic Zionism. And so this article that I wrote for Crisis, and what partly inspired it was I saw that it was leading to the slaughter of Palestinians. And I saw even the Latin Patriarch Jerusalem repeatedly saying, look, what's going on with the Christians in the West? And so I was horrified at how excuses were being made for how the Palestinians were being treated, and watching the entire West ignoring it while the Christian leadership in the Middle East was pleading for help and assistance and making very clear the abuses that were going on. And I felt the need to stand up and write again. Now, I didn't originally title that Crisis magazine Against Catholic Zionism because I didn't want to point fingers at anyone. What I simply actually originally called it was No Longer Your Grandfather's Zionism, a look at Benedict XVI and St. John of the Cross, to get Catholics to understand our view of who Israel is and the right way to understand the promises originally given to Abraham, but only realize when Israel matured into the Messiah. That's what Israel has become now. It's not being replaced. It's not overthrown. But Israel was always moving towards becoming the church. That in God's plan, the end was always the Catholic Church. The Israelite society was only a beginning that was always meant to become that. And so I moved through what Benedict was saying from his 2018. I opened the article up with Benedict's 2018 discussion on the proper way to understand the relationship of Israel to the land today, that we do not support forms of Zionism that support taking land. And that Catholic doctrine in no way can ever accept that that's a fulfillment of promises in relationship to the land. And so I felt the need to write this because I'm concerned with injustices that are being done and violations of international law, violations that are being not only proclaimed by Christians, but even former prime ministers talking about war crimes being committed by the. So all of that led to this writing of that article.
Nice.
And by the way, I have a relationship with the Melkites, which are Palestinian Christians.
Great.
So my children were initiated with the Melkites.
Oh, okay.
some with other Eastern churches, but I'm more aware of what's happening with Palestinian Christians perhaps than most Western Christians are.
Okay, great. And just a side personal question, are you a Greek Rite Catholic then? You
That's hard for me to explain briefly.
okay,
So
okay,
I'll answer real quickly. Yes.
okay,
Um, but I've been practicing the past few years more with the Western Church.
okay,
And so I do have strong ties. My father was Greek Orthodox. He was brought into the Roman Catholics at an early age when his father had abandoned his family. And so because of this, we had a bit of a claim um, to the Eastern churches. And
okay.
so as Catholics, I was raised mostly in the West in terms of my theology, but my affinity is for the Greek fathers, and I worship with the East as well. So I worship with both.
Excellent. Well, Christos Anesti. Yeah. I was Eastern
Let
Orthodox before
Nasty.
this, so I'm very familiar with the Eastern Orthodox. And I think that we need to very much emphasize, even if we would grant for the sake of argument like Catholic Zionism is true, even in that case, they cannot justify any atrocities against the Palestinians or any war crimes or anything like that. That can never be justified in any case, even if they believe in some kind of promise.
I would even suggest, yeah, I would even suggest that somehow I would go further. And so I don't, to the degree that they have Catholic Zionism that is a political, secular kind, whatever, have a ball. But I think you do have to answer lots of questions still about justice and injustice and international law with that. But I would go further and say, actually, to anyway say that it's a positive fulfillment, a Catholic Zionism that sees as a positive fulfillment that God wills the taking of the land, right? So whenever you mention the land as fulfillment of prophecy, I would say that's also forbidden as a
Okay.
Catholic. And I'll justify and explain that later based on some questions you're going to ask.
Yeah, we'll get into that because I'll get to your most bold statement, I think. Let me just clarify this part because this seems to be what you just said. You said, I believe I can agree with a secular Zionism. It sounds like what you're saying is this part in your article where you say
Yeah,
this quote, the original form of Zionism, which the Vatican informally accepted, was one founded on a secular movement of Jewish ethnicity. In the early 20th century, the secularism and agnosticism of its leaders seemingly posed little threat of becoming a faith state. And at the end of this paragraph, you say ancient Jewish ties to Palestine and sympathies for their terrible persecutions, so post World War II, made sense for the Vatican to accept what the British inaugurated and left behind. So it sounds like what you're saying. Okay, if there are Jews who were already there or they happen to just legally and justly migrate there under the law and everybody's rights are respected, that's fine. It sounds like what is that what you're saying in terms of a totally
that's definitely what
political?
I'm saying. In
Okay,
other words, the Vatican inherited a situation over which it had no control. So when the League of Nations handed over to the British their mandate, there was under the British and under their colonial system, there was a migration that they oversaw, even though you could argue details and nuances as to how much they were able to control what happened. Nevertheless, the migration that took place was overall legal. And so therefore that situation that the world is left with that situation, the world has to respect it because it happened under legal international treaties. And so I would argue that for that right, those borders that were accepted by the United Nations in 1948, I think the world has a right to respect those borders based on international law. I can support that.
okay.
Now, I might be a little wrong in some of the things I said, in which, there was no glimpse that there might be an eventual faith problem. Clearly, there were radical elements that were always seen as fringe and radical. I think Benedict the 16th's article in 2018 is saying because those always were seen as fringe and radical and suppressed by law, terrorism was condemned, even though it had happened. Abuse of others was condemned, even though it happened. The Vatican had reason to hope that the radical fringe would be kept at bay, that there wouldn't be justification of what, for instance, the former head of Mossad, who retired in 2016, you know, in September of 2022, said Israel's an apartheid state. So, um, and now more than ever, we're seeing what was fringe has become mainstream. And I think that's part of the reason Benedict wrote his 2018 Communio article, because we didn't expect this radical quick change in which this movement to take land as what was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy was somehow now to be justified. And even worse, everyone was watching the Christian Zionists in America be the foundation from which the religious Zionists in Israel were operating from. And so because of that, I think we have the strong statement in 2018 and even later from Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI.
Yeah, Mr. Taborn was in his excellent presentations pointed out the terrorism that was going on before 1948 and how some of these individuals became part of the Israeli government who previously had committed acts of terrorism. And of course, all of the injustices and UN declarations against various actions of the state of Israel and whatnot. Let's move into the theological aspect, because it seems to me that the summation of your argument is contained in this statement, which is basically theological Zionism is Antichrist. You say taking God's promises to Abraham too literally and in rejection of Jesus Christ is actually now a rejection of God. It ignores the magnitude of 2,000 years. It is against God's revealed Messiah, and so it is rightly called Antichrist. And this is what has led to just seizing land and treating human beings as without right. So, can you please unpack this? This is a bold statement. Let's give us the basics of why this is the case from your point of view.
Because the whole premise in any attempt to expand beyond the 1948 borders, which I argue again, I am for a two-state solution. I want the Jews, according to that 1948 boundaries that was accepted at that time. I want them to have their own state based on the legality, overall legality, of what happened according to international law. Once you start arguing with me as a Christian that you have a right to the land based on God's promises, and you have the right to push other people off that land who do not accept your religious views on fulfillment of prophecy, once you say that, and the background behind your religious Zionism is to bring a Messiah other than Jesus Christ, then you are anti-Jesus Christ, and therefore you are behaving in a manner that is anti-Christ and going against God's will, religiously speaking, and when claiming to speak for God. And so since I'm a Christian, I cannot accept the idea that that land holds the same meaning that it did because of what Jesus said about that land and what St. Paul teaches about who Israel is today. And so since Jesus said in Matthew 21, he tells a parable. And he says, the Lord sent his prophets. Well, the owner of the vineyard sent his servants, talking about the vineyard. And they go to collect what's due them. And the people beat them and abuse them when they go to collect from the land, those people who are the tenants of the land, they beat and abuse the ones that the landowner sends. And the landowner is God in this parable that's given. And then they start to kill the people that are being sent to them to collect from the Lord. And then the Lord says, surely they'll respect my son. But instead they say, no, this is the guy who's going to inherit the land. This is the guy who's going to take all of this, and it really is going to belong to him. Let's kill him. And so Christ says, what do you think the landowner is going to do to the tenants? They said, he's going to kick them off and give that land to someone else. And Jesus says, that's right. So in other words, the result of rejecting the Messiah will be the destruction of the people who are the tenants of that land, and he will give that land to another people. And so in other words, the whole reason the land belongs to the people is only insofar as they're in covenant with God. That land belongs ultimately to the people of God, insofar as it served a pedagogical purpose to prepare for the coming of the Messiah. It loses its pedagogical purpose once the Messiah comes, because he's the true lamb that was always being promised. We have to understand that it was always what is Judaism? It's a religion awaiting the Messiah. So ultimately, its true religion is the religion of the Messiah. Well, the Messiah has come, and he has the right to interpret what God always intended. And so, based on what Christ said, those who are not in covenant with God, and the covenant continues only with the Messiah, have no right to the land. And I would even argue that, I'll pause there, but I'd even argue it more deeply. It relates back to Moses' promise in Deuteronomy 18:18 to send a prophet, and the requirement of the people to follow the prophet, or they'll be required of it by God for not following the prophet. And that's what leads us into the whole Pauline understanding that what was Israel according to the flesh has become Israel according to the Spirit, which is now the Israel of God. So how we move from where God wanted to take Israel to where God did take Israel, this is the mystery of Christ and the church, which does not reject Jews, but invites them to become more fully Jewish and accept the Messiah.